All right, hello everyone. I'm Eric Hekler, core faculty in MHTI. I'm really sorry I couldn't join you guys for this first session. I was hoping to, but uh, here I'm gonna at least give this little video recording of this. So today I want to just give you an overview of this idea of this digital therapeutics real-world evidence framework plus partnership strategies approaches. And you'll see at the end there's some key papers with a lot of like online supplemental materials that are really meant to kind of help you guys kind of navigate this early stage of the MHTI training and otherwise. So just to give you a little sense of what we're going to talk about in the next 30 minutes or so. Um, why DTx needs a unified framework, so particularly the gap of what we were trying to fulfill as we developed this framework, what the framework is, this four-phase development of design, develop, test, and monitor. Critically, we then integrate this into how we can leverage this, particularly through really strong partnership processes to try to bridge digital divides and expanding our notion of what that is. And then finally, getting started. Basically, just how does this apply to you guys as you are getting rolling in our MHTI group? So to start, of course, let's just start with a definition. What do I mean by digital therapeutic? And so this is a definition commonly used. They are health software tools designed to prevent, treat, or manage a disease, disorder, or condition, or injury by delivering evidence-based interventions directly to patients. So critically, the DTx are being increasingly seen as something that's held to the similar standards of evidence and regulatory oversight of other traditional medications. And this makes it a bit distinct from general wellness or fitness apps, which kind of hit in a different class. Of course, just to be clear, I think actually a lot of the ideas that are used in this framework could actually be used as well for general wellness. But we're really trying to be mindful of making sure we, meet not just the requirements for that wellness, which actually has lower evidentiary needs, but that higher bar. And our general sense is if you can do it for this higher bar, you can also benefit from even if you're doing more general wellness or otherwise. But just to give you a sense of some of the ways that you might think about this, different examples. One could be, tools to support medication adherence, right? Apps to monitor, remind, and support patients to have a regular medication work. Behavioral health things like providing cognitive behavioral therapy for things like insomnia, depression, or substance use. Chronic disease management, right? You can imagine diabetes management tool that's adapting support to individuals. Particularly integrating and linking with other tools like continuous glucose monitors or insulin pumps or, artificial pancreas systems, combining that. Or you can imagine things for like helping with physical activity, particularly around like cardiac rehab or other sorts of areas where you might be providing personalized goals and feedback and you're integrating sensor data and algorithms, potentially also building into like the hypertension monitoring and things of that sort. Or you can imagine things like mental health support, right? So between visit support for perhaps for anxiety or PTSD, or even starting to get into, where there might be chatbot tools and sort of having chatbots and other generative AI tools integrated into this support. And then finally, you can imagine things like pediatric, both like young and older adults, right? Sort of like pediatric care or potentially older adult care for cognitive health and sort of building gamified tools and things to kind of help with attention or otherwise. All of these are kind of variations of the kind of things that we could imagine you guys might be trying to create in MHTI. Critically, it's always important to remember that these are often very complex interventions with multiple interacting components, right? And they're changing over time, which sets up some inherent issues to work through. So with that as the definition, let's talk a little bit about both the promise and the challenge, right? So the promise is, right, we basically are trying to create tools that can be safe, effective, accessible, equitable, sustainable, and scalable to help individual and population health. That's the hope, but of course, right now, unfortunately, there is no real single unified framework that really guides all evidence production across the full life scale, particularly one that's been accepted by regulators. So just to be clear, this is something we have offered and developed. You can see we wrote the paper in 2024 and we have our partnership process kind of coming out in 2026. So this is very new, but we think it is a structure that could help, but it hasn't yet been fully adopted by others, just to be transparent. Critically, though, beyond that, it is very common for research grade code to not make it past the research grade work and get deployed into real world settings. The flip side is there are a lot of DTx, digital therapeutics companies, or DTx, if I say DTx, digital therapeutics, DTx companies that have gone bankrupt, partially, I think, because of the insufficient reimbursement clarity, and also, I think, how to build evidence in ways that actually can fit into their normal workflows and otherwise. And then ultimately, populations most in need are often excluded from designing and testing these tools. We'll get into a lot more detail about that when we get into the partnership process work. Right. But so with this, why do we need a framework? Is basically critical. A DTX is software, right? It's dynamic. It's needing upgrades and maintenance and interoperability issues, right? And so the enterprise grade code needs to be robust to handle all that. But oftentimes the research grade code that's used is rarely sufficient for that, right? Like usually research grade code is just enough to help you test an idea. And that's cool. That's fine. There's actually a lot of value to that. But if you really want it sustained, you need to keep the architecture set in a way such that you can have all the updates and you can make sure that all your application programming interfaces or APIs are working well and updated. And that takes a lot of work, right? There's also, of course, then the regulatory complexity, right? There's, again, no pathway exists, right? And so if you go into the paper, you'll see some of the examples we read and saw as things that we could pull as options within here. But really, at this point, we needed something that could kind of match on to how people kind of expect to do regulation. So something akin to the pharmaceutical four-phase model, but one that actually fits DTX. And so we basically thought there was a need for something that basically honors both this software and therapeutic thing, right? Guiding evidence production that matches this inherently dynamic, context-dependent nature of DTX. And so the approach is the digital therapeutics real-world evidence framework, which is a pragmatic, iterative, milestone-driven approach adapted from Orbit model, which is an approach used for behavioral interventions, but with clear adaptations for really the unique characteristics of these digital therapeutics. Critically, leveraging the value of real-world data integration across the full life cycle. So, what is the framework? Here's the basics of it, right? And so you can see there's a very clear goals, which are basically those little ovals, right? Problem specification, solution specification. And then we translate that into simple decisions, right? So you can see in the phase one, have needs, assets, constraints, and sustainability plans in the target population used been satisfactorily defined? Yes. And have you have a minimal viable product? That's the MVP, and corresponding benchmarks been established? Yes. You can go on to the next phase, and you can see the whole thing flows like this to try to really turn this into an iterative flowing process where you can have clear benchmarks where you can ultimately translate that to, yep, I've got what I need. I can move on to the next stage. Right. So just to kind of tag it at a high level, and we'll go into each one of these phases in more depths. The first phase is design, right? And it's really around defining clearly what your problem and your solution actually are using human-centered design strategies, right? And critically, the goal is to create some minimal viable product and a benchmark, and benchmarks that you can then judge if you're actually solving the problem with fidelity. When you have that, you can start getting into the development phase. And this is where we really invite the idea of both proof of concept trials and optimization trials, which we'll get into more depth, but this is a really big area here. The idea is basically producing evidence to show that the DTX elements are working as needed and the package can plausibly produce a meaningful results using the notion of benchmarking, which is the critical idea of a proof of concept trial. And when you have those things, you can then start to move forward into phase three. This is where you would have, more of your classic randomized controlled trial style work, right? So you're studying effectiveness trials because the whole idea here is we're consciously trying to do things that are working in the real world, and so embracing that complexity. And then we're drawing from ideas and from prior work on how to actually balance sort of explanatory insights with pragmatism. So that's where the process two work comes into play, and otherwise, and building benchmarks around it. But ultimately, the idea is you're trying to produce a digital therapeutic that has clinically meaningful effects that would change clinical equipoise. So basically, shift how people make decisions to say, "Yep, we should do this instead of that." Right? That's the goal. And with that, we can then make the argument, yes, now this can be released. And critically, because it's a digital therapeutic, we know it's not a definitive trial. We know, okay, we just left that out. We need to now use real world data to monitor, is it still working? Right? Can we improve it? Can we even expand it? And then brief, those are the questions to be monitoring in this final phase. So that's and you can see then all of these are always flowing back and inviting us back into redefining, did we define our problem well? And that often is a key part of the flow. So this is really this idea of a life cycle where you are constantly iterating and flowing and refining within work. So that's the overview. Let's unpack a little bit of this. And so critically, there are these four phases, right? So the phase one, really, the methods used are things like formative research, co-design, human-centered design, literature reviews, theory development, right? And you'll notice there's this strong focus on this idea of like clearly defining a benchmark that allows you to say, "Yep, I've hit this with methods that are fit for this purpose." So a critical idea that I really try to advocate for is the idea of rigor is not something like linked to some gold standard method. Rigor is defined by your purpose, and so you really need to think fit for what purpose, and how do you then define that? You define that using a benchmark. Right. And so the whole starting phase is really getting a sense of what is the meaningful benchmarks for your program or group. Like what would be like, the outcome that you'd want to see for like, say, the CBT insomnia to say, yes, I am doing something meaningful here if I'm building a CBT insomnia app that would support, say, 50% of this population actually remitting from their insomnia or 60% of the group that I'm working with, something like that. Right. You want to have those very clearly defined because the more and more you have clarity on that, the more it feeds into then your development work, right? And then you could start asking, okay, I've got my benchmark. I got to do better than what's currently existing, right? Like maybe current CBTI tools only help 40% of the population. And so I want to try to get to 50%. How am I going to do that? I'm going to optimize all the elements of my intervention. And this is where all of these trial designs from the multi-phase optimization strategy really become gold, right? This is where all that beautiful evidence of factorial trials and smart trials and micro-randomization trials and hybrid versions and things like that really come into play. And I'm not going to depth on these, but we will be getting into this. We have lots of resources for you if you don't know what all these trial designs are to teach you about them. But the general idea is within these sort of optimization trials, and I would also add a proof of concept trial, there always is this clear definition of success that is empirically testable, right? That's the core idea. And again, that's what I mean by a benchmark. And that is what is fit for purpose for development, right? Like, are all my elements working as I think they should? Am I getting a signal that this whole package can plausibly produce an outcome that is better than what I'm trying to improve upon, right? So if it's like the current world has 40% of people supported by the current CBT insomnia, I actually think it's higher, by the way, but I'm sorry for those who actually know that work, and I might be just completely misstating that, but using it more as a thought exercise, right? Like there's 40% of people benefiting from this, you're trying to get to 50%, right? Like that becomes the target of these proof of concept trials that allow you then know if you're making progress and you're doing better than what currently exists. And then once you do that, you can then start asking, okay, well, you know what? I've got something. Now you bring in all your pragmatic clinical trial logic and you start really thinking how to work this in the real world. And so the key idea here is you shift your benchmarking to more of the tools that are used for making claims of generalization, right? You're trying to say, I'm getting something working here, and I'm trying to say and make a claim that it works more broadly beyond just my sample to the population this is meant to support. And so with that, that's we bring in all of our clinical trial stuff. This is where we have the critical importance of the comparator you select, the critical importance of knowing what a threshold of clinical significance is, right? Where it's really saying, yes, that is a meaningful enough difference between the current standard of care and what I'm trying to replace it with, such that I would shift and start using that instead. And then, of course, you need tool inferential statistics terms like p-values or otherwise, or credibility intervals if you use a Bayesian approach to make those claims. And then last but not least, you can get into phase 4 work, which is where you're in all these phases, by the way, you're always using real world data, but you really integrate it in this final stage to kind of constantly monitor, is it still working? Is there diminishing effects? Is there a signal that, maybe there's some element in here that's not working and I need to improve it and so forth. And you can see that, like, here's where I also would invite you to kind of play with the idea of a small data paradigm, which is really building in local contexts and working from people's localized data. But I don't have time to get into that, but just sort of an alluding to that idea. So that's the methods, right? Let's just kind of unpack then. Okay, how then do you start building a team to start building that? And this is where the idea of, we highlight these kind of 3 key roles in this sort of seeding this idea of a partnership process, right? So the first is a digital therapeutics implementer. So think of this as like an industry partner, or perhaps a medical center who's capable of actually maintaining software code, or a public health department or otherwise, right? The key idea is somebody who is capable of ongoing sustained deployment of this digital therapeutic with fidelity. So building that enterprise grade code, if you will, that I brought up. Then we'd also, this is the critical one that I think is often skipped, is the idea of actually working meaningfully with community serving organizations. So these are the folks who are actually working with actual people in real world and fully engage with the real world problems, and ideally have real world data. So you can think like federally qualified health centers, community clinics, public health departments, community-based organizations, a variety of different groups that are actually deeply working and integrating with actual people. And then finally, the methods dorks, right? That's like the way I think about myself. And so this is the the folks who actually understand all of these various methods and their phases. And so this is where academics might come into play, or evaluation firms, or embedded researchers. And then, of course, also ethics review. And so notice, technically, you can have a team that holds all of these in one, right? You can imagine like a really well-resourced medical center that can basically build code, they're serving community members, and they've got the support. But you don't have to have everybody in one shop. You could actually be building partnerships between groups, like an industry partner collaborating with a federally qualified health center and an academic group kind of helping with the methods group. Yeah, and any one of those variations is kind of what we're trying to invite you to think about. So with that, let's kind of unpack each one of the phases a little bit more. So phase one, define the problem and create a minimal viable product with clear benchmarks. So the first stage is just clearly defining what is the problem. Identify the real world needs, the constraints, assets, and sustainability plans. And ideally, this is where you really pull in the real world data from your community serving organizations. Also doing things like formative research, community driven methods, literature reviews, market analysis, right? And the whole idea is a decision is really you're driving forward an idea where you're like, yeah, I think I have clarity on a problem that is really meaningful and important to, and if we addressed it, it would really help people in the real world. But it's also something that we think a digital therapeutic would actually serve, knowing there's plenty of things that are important to work on that don't fit into a digital therapeutic framework. And then the other side is that, okay, if we know what a problem is and we think we have a sense of like, okay, how a digital therapeutic would help, then you do the iterative work of actually designing a digital therapeutic. And we particularly invite you to use Agile and Scrum type of logic and prototyping, particularly from low fidelity, like paper prototypes to functional code. And your focus is really just trying to get it like a signal of like, yeah, I have clarity on what the benchmarks are and how to work it, right? And the whole idea is you transition to the phase two when you've got some basic thing working that you know is meeting some basic ethical and functional and usability requirements. And then you've also defined this sort of criteria of minimum effectiveness and safety, right? So it's like getting the 50% marker and nobody's getting harmed by this. And you can then also imagine sustainability markers and a bunch of other things. We would invite you to look into the STEEP criteria, look into the paper for more details. So if you go to that, then you can start getting to phase two, right? The goal here is to produce the evidence that the DTx is actually working. Its elements are working individually and as a package to produce effects that are hitting your clinically meaningful benchmark, right? And so one half is a proof of concept trial. And the whole idea here is really you need to know that you want to be able to learn quickly. And so the idea is you want to try to be able to learn as fast as possible with as small as samples as possible. But the rub is that when you have really small samples, you actually can't use all the classic inferential stats. You're just breaking the p-value, basically. But the other side is we're humans, and so we want to see what we want to see. And so the way that you resolve that to basically allow you to learn fast, but not lie to yourself, is through a proof of concept trial. And what do? You basically set benchmarks that can be fully measured using purely descriptive statistics. The idea is you set up a target that if you meet, and you can then, of course, negotiate on, is that actually clinically meaningful? Is it plausible? And that's all the kind of stuff that you need to navigate. You can look into the paper for more details on this. But the general idea is allowing you to learn quickly with proof of concept trials to see if you're hitting a benchmark using purely descriptive stats. And you keep iterating on that until you really hit it meaningfully way. And if not, you iterate, right? And of course, with that's sort of getting you an initial signal to learn quickly on how good your package is working. Critically, though, your packages are built of a bunch of little elements and components. They can be, different modules that are actually useful for some type of behavioral change or process. They can be sort of system models and algorithms to kind of map out the complexity of how this fits into a broader stuff so it knows how to interact with other systems. It could be adaptation algorithms where it's really started putting these things together to say, okay, well, if I see this, then I will do that. And so how do you do that? This is where all the optimization trials come into play, and you can see some examples of these. And with these, each optimization trial has and can be set up to have clear go, no-go decisions. So like, for example, a factorial trial, as used in most, is all about this idea of no dead weight. You basically only have interventions that work. You only have components that all have shown to be demonstrated to be useful. And if there are any components that have not been shown useful, you throw them out, right? That's the sort of idea. And each one of these has that kind of logic, right? But now you're improving the elements, right? And so the key here is a key shift here is that we are very much defining this phase one and two as not subservient to phase three. We actually see this as a rigorous form of quality improvement to just go back and forth between phase one and phase two. And so I just wanted to tag that of like, I think technically, if you're really working in a local context and you're kind of in a learning health system logic, phase one and phase two is actually a really powerful tool. As long as you're not trying to make a claim, this works elsewhere, right? When you want to make the claim, this isn't just useful here, but it's useful elsewhere, you need to go to phase three. But if you're really just trying to iteratively improve, how do I build digital therapeutics to work really well here? Phase one and phase two can be a very powerful structure to actually do that rigorously. But with that said, let's say you do want to extend it out, right? This is where you actually try to test, is this really meaningful in the real world, right? And so the goal here is really we bias towards pragmatism and effectiveness over explanatory knowledge. We particularly invite you to use the modified consort diagram of re-aim, which is basically asking you to really carefully define your transportability or generalization claims. Critically, it's so important to really be very careful on your comparator selection, right? We're trying to think about there's a current thing that's the current default option used in the real world, and we're trying to replace it with something else or add to it, right? Or say like there's a gap and we need you to start using this, right? And so selecting the comparator is really critical, and there's a paper in there that we reference to really help you guide your work through this. And then finally, real world data becomes absolutely critical for actually doing your power calculations here, right? Because it's the real world data where you really start to say, this is the threshold of clinical significance where I would change my mind, where clinical equipoise would shift. And then by extension, you can also look to real world data in prior work to really say, is it actually plausible that I would get this effect with this intervention, right? And so you really don't use underpowered pilot trials. And you notice here, there's also this idea of this little loop of like, is evidence available to show an effectiveness trial can be even conducted? This is the idea of running feasibility or pilots where you're actually studying basically, can I recruit people at the right at a fast enough rate? Can I randomize? Can they stay retained at a level so that I can actually produce robust evidence, right? That's sort of this little loop here on the side. And ultimately, then you run a trial to really figure this out. And of course, there's actually a variety of options you can work to actually do this. The critical idea here is a definitive trial is inappropriate for digital therapeutics, right? Software requires continuous updates and making this ongoing monitoring essential. After that, you have phase four, right? Monitoring in the real world, right? And so you ask, like, is there any diminishing effects? And so you're tracking this with the real world data of all the stuff you can get from digital therapeutics themselves, right? And particularly if you're integrated into like a healthcare system or otherwise, you have a lot of data you can actually monitor to see if it's still working as you think it should. And if it's not, go back to design. You need to update the tool, right? Or you can say, hey, look, there might be some opportunities to improve this, right? And so going back to those earlier phases of phase one and two, just for the pure sake of making it work better, perhaps in a localized context or otherwise. And then, of course, you can then also see as you do that, you might start asking, okay, well, actually, I think there's an even broader reach here, right? This was maybe working for insomnia patients, but now maybe I can also do this for, a different group that also is dealing with sleep issues, but maybe it's not full on insomnia, like great. That's where you can kind of pull the real world data to really do this, right? And so the key idea that this is a digital therapeutic is never done. It's always evolving with everything else. All right. And so just come back to it. Here's the map of all those methods, and I won't restate them, just given time things, right? So what makes this different? One, it's milestone driven, right? We have clear go, no-go decisions at every phase, right? This is reducing the risk, basically trying to really shift this idea of the only thing that is rigorous is an RTT to instead, rigor is defined by the purpose. And therefore, the whole idea is you're doing methods that are fit for purpose, and you define the purpose with a milestone, with a clear milestone and benchmarking. You're using real world data throughout, particularly ideally with your partnership, to really make sure, are you doing stuff that would truly help the real world, right? Critically, no phase is subservient in this model, right? Notice phase one and two in particular can really stand alone as potentially a form of a learning health system type of logic if you're really just trying to figure out how do I get stuff to work really robustly here? And then eventually when you do that in a real world context like an FQHC, in my hunch is you're very much more likely to have something that would actually scale robustly and therefore really warrant having that phase three work. Of course, it's also built, it is software. And so it's built to recognize there's no such thing as a definitive trial here. Critically, we also really strongly emphasize health equity, both with the real world data and the partnership, which we're going to get to next. And then finally, and then with that, the partnership process, really trying to build that design. So if that's the framework, I want to now think about this from a health equity end and particularly how to bridge the digital divides. So there's another paper that I would invite you to look at, but we really anchor on this idea of that there's actually multiple forms of divide here that go on a continuum from development to delivery. And so the idea is there's a knowledge divide, basically gaps in the available knowledge across the continuum from development to delivery. There's a divide in actually what kind of evidence gets produced and who's involved in producing that evidence, such that, the classic thing from disabilities community, nothing about us without us, right? Like, how often is evidence produced without the people most involved in the work coming into play? And then that cascades into what then gets produced and then who gets to adopt it, right? These are cascading effects. And I'd invite you to look at the paper for more depth on all of this, but just as an overview, really trying to invite this much more broader notion of a digital divide into here. Right. And so one of the key ways that we're thinking about how to manage this is to honor the idea that all of us contain multitudes. We all have both potentially relevant lived expertise and trained expertises for the kind of work we're working through. And so the lived expertise is that personal knowledge rooted in direct experience. It's a tacit knowledge that isn't necessarily reducible into the kind of formal objective terms and otherwise, right? And critically, this is the stuff like you have personal experience in managing chronic conditions or navigating a safety net system or so forth and so on. This becomes the fodder of like, okay, what actually is true in the real world? On the flip side, of course, we also have our trained expertise, right? And this is the stuff that, of course, you all have, right? With having specialized knowledge on formal study designs and credentialing and all this. And this is really valuable too, right? And the goal is trying to figure out how do you actually get these to be working really well together such that you're honoring and flowing between these different types of expertise. And so you can see this sort of lived expertise, trained expertise. This is mapping onto the phases: design, develop, test, monitor. And then you can see there's all these different things. And in brief, there's a worksheet to help you kind of think through this. But the idea we're trying to show here is that you can actually create teams where you're flowing back and forth on who among your team should be driving the conversation. And this is actually based on sociologist Cecilia Ridgway's work on cultural schema work, which basically shows that the idea that status hierarchies can emerge within minutes in new teams and stabilize quickly. And they often can accumulate to kind of reify old default options on notions of status. And this is something we're consciously trying to break, right? So in these typical DTx teams, for example, you can imagine there you start to automatically confer status to basically maybe people who have the highest credentials or so forth and so on, not necessarily the folks who have the most lived expertise or otherwise. And this misalignment, we would argue, really propagates that digital divides that we were just getting at before. And so the result is interventions that can often fail to really just even acknowledge and know that there are real world barriers, overlooking accessibility constraints and so forth to work through. And so the core question for everything is basically, who has the most holistic grasp of reality for this decision? And how do you build teams to work through that? Right. And so that's what we've been trying to move on here is this idea of dynamic expertise, right? Where you're moving from sort of automatic to contextual status allocation, where it's not really about just credentials conferring authority, but you really ask who has the most relevant expertise for this decision. And from implicit to explicit expertise mapping, right? You make visible all the lived and trained expertises that each person is bringing into this, such that you can incorporate that as part of your decision making. And then from this, you move from a kind of singular to a multidimensional recognition of all the different things we need to actually make these decisions together. And then you're flowing such that you know that different people have different expertises and you can learn how to tune into that depending on the decision you're making. And then ultimately this shifts from a very static to a dynamic form of authority making, right? And so with this, we offer you a toolkit to actually work through this, right? And it's basically a tool to help you. It's been drawn from a variety of different things, team science and otherwise, but it's helping you to assess these diverse expertises, define your roles dynamically, and map to the decision priorities that you're making over time. Right. And to connect it to the partnership reg, right? So you can see that, this is sort of where you get into maybe in phase one, more lived expertise as the orientation. Whereas this, you might blend lived and trained expertise in phase two. Whereas this, you might have more methods expertise in phase three. And then really you're getting into the data scientist, perhaps in the implementation group in phase four, right? Just as a quick illustrative example of how this maps out, right? So with that, I want to end because I'm getting close to my time. How do you get started, right? You are a multidisciplinary team, and that's beautiful, right? What we are trying to get you to do is a transdisciplinary innovation, which is really the idea that you're moving beyond just the multidisciplinary collaboration to true, genuine co-creation, right? The challenge you have right now is You're working with people you may not have met before. You each bring different disciplinary vocabularies and assumptions. You need to converge on a concrete DTx project relatively quickly. And with this, the default can often be to either align to the loudest voice or the most senior person and those status dynamics. And so what you want to do is shift that, right? And so based on our years of work, we found that you need to anchor on the practice first. Like first, just to get to know each other, we'll come back to that. And then you start tuning into, okay, who has the best grasp in your team of a real world challenge that you could all feel that you could contribute to? And then from that, try to really dig into make it as concrete as possible so everyone can see the real world challenges, the barriers, but maybe also the assets and strengths you could leverage. And then from that, now you start storming and norming, where you really try to build a transdisciplinary approach. It's just basically when you combine your powers to do something you couldn't do alone. And then ultimately, you can then map it onto the therapeutics framework to actually build out how you do it. Right. So I think that I'm mindful that I'm running out of time. So I just want to say, you can anchor into practice, basically look around your team and figure out who has that knowledge. And the real reason is so that you really anchor in the real world, right? Then steps two, this is where you start really asking, okay, what's a challenge that can leverage all of our superpowers together, right? Like my patient with type 2 diabetes struggles to maintain medication adherence, right? Maybe something like this, or you can see a variety of other ones, and you can see these slides. I'll share them too. You can kind of look at these, right? The goal here is though, basically get specific, right? It's not just improve health outcomes, get it concrete, because the more concrete it is for everyone, the easier it is for everyone to start seeing how they can contribute. Now getting into the storming and norming, right? Like what does an engineer or computer science person bring in versus a behavioral scientist versus a medical provider versus a public health person, a data scientist, right? You're each asking complementary questions that actually allow you to build this magic of a solution that could not come together with any one discipline alone. It really manifests because you're all yet leveraging the wisdom of each other and creating something that can't be created alone. Right. And then finally, you can map this up onto like, okay, well, how do I start producing evidence, right? Where are we? Are we in design, development, so forth and so on? Who is fulfilling the various roles? How would we actually think about this in a sustainable way? How am I defining good enough on effectiveness, safety? What kind of real world data can we pull for this? And then ultimately, you start thinking about the types of decisions that you're making and allowing that to kind of flow together. Right. And so just to link this on, where you're going to be next is you're basically starting with introductions. Each member should share your relevant lived and trained expertise. And we'd invite you to use the worksheet as a guide where you can kind of do your self-assessment before you do this. And then you anchor. Okay, start thinking about those practical real world experiences among your team members that you can all see as something you can contribute to. And critically, you want to find a thing that everyone in your team can contribute to. That's then you storm and norm. How do we start to do this shift from multidisciplinary to transdisciplinary work where you combine your superpowers? And then ultimately, that's the feed, that's the foundation that when you get together, we can really start doing magic together when we're together. So, takeaways. The framework provides a pragmatic, iterative, milestone-driven roadmap for evidence production, from design to long-term monitoring. The digital divide extends beyond just the access into all the other areas. Right. And we think a critical piece of this is these dynamic partnerships, particularly that honor lived and trained expertise. It's not optional. It's the foundation that helps us to tether to real world context. Not only that, your MHTI team is basically the raw material for transdisciplinary innovation. And we hope that this structure can help you to find through that. And so we'd really invite you to read both papers carefully and then start to use all the resources to kind of help you guide this forward. And here's all the links to all the things, both the framework, online supplement of an example of how to actually this flows across the 4 phases, the partnership process, and then particularly the worksheet to kind of help you get started. That's it. Thank you so much.